Hi, I recently received a question, what happens to my trust when I die? And that's really asking a question further down the line of our evaluation when someone dies. Really what we start with is the assets. And when you talk about assets, you should be really asking about ownership documents. Who owns those assets? So let me give you a few examples and then to illustrate what I mean. Well, for a house, how do we know who owns a house? And the typical answer is you look at a piece of paper. It's an ownership document, and it's called a deed. With a car, you would normally look at, or you'd contact the Secretary of State, but you'd look at title. Okay? And there's actually a piece of paper that's the car title. And people often don't know this one, but for bank accounts or brokerage accounts or investment accounts, there's actually a contract you do with the bank when you sign off to start that account, and that's called a deposit agreement. These documents, or in this case with the bank, it's in a contract, indicate who the owner is. So we literally read through those documents and we say, okay, here is the owner, and if the owner is the decedent, then I'm going to put DECD for decedent, then we're looking for something else. We're not only looking for that, we're also looking to see if there's a beneficiary designations. For example, a bank account might have a beneficiary. That's where we start. If the house is in the name of decedent's trust, then the trust owns it. But let's say it's not. Let's say it's just in the decedent's name. And let's say the car's in the decedent's name. And let's say the deposit agreement is in the decedent's name. In that case, then we don't have anything inside the trust. So the trust will only receive the assets if you have a will that transfers the assets to the trust. When you fund the trust correctly and when you set things up properly, what you should see when I look at these ownership documents is I should see deed is in the trust. I should see trust. I should see that the car is owned by the trust. And I should see that the bank account is owned by the trust or the beneficiary is the trust. If that's the case, then we do not need the will. But if you didn't fund the trust, we will need the will. What does that mean? That means that if you have a pour-over will, we'll eventually get to the trust, and then the trust applies. So what happens with the trust? We read the trust, and we follow the instructions, because all a trust is a set of instructions. So when you're asking what happens when someone dies, it's a very detailed question because it really depends on their assets. And once we do this tier evaluation, then we look at the ownership documents. Once we look at the ownership documents control. In the absence of the ownership documents saying anything, then we have to look at the will. Hopefully you had a pour-over will at the same time you had a trust, and it pours into the trust. At this point, we're in probate. If you did everything right and named the trust and all these assets, then we're avoiding probate. But that's really what needs to take place for you to answer, for me to be able to answer that question. So what happens with the trust when you die? In case assets are owned by it, then we follow those instructions. If assets aren't owned by it, if they're owned jointly with somebody, if you have a joint account, then it goes to that person and we bypass the trust. That's why you got to be very careful when preparing estate plans. You've got to be careful that you're looking at these ownership level documents. If you have any further questions, give me, Mario Correa, a call at 773-489-8500.